Okay folks, in this video we're going to talk about genetic disease. First, let's talk about what a disease is. Here are a couple of definitions. A disease is an abnormal condition that affects the body of an organism, or a disorder of structure or function in a human, animal, or plant, especially one that produces specific signs or symptoms, or that affects a specific location and is not simply a direct result of physical injury. And finally, a particular quality, habit, or disposition regarded as adversely affecting a person or a group of people. There are many definitions for disease, and I would encourage you to come up with your own definition. If you went to the doctor and asked them about a skin growth that you had on the side of your nose that's kind of like a mole, some doctors would say, yeah, that's a disease. Others would say, no, that's just a structural abnormality, but they wouldn't categorize it as a disease. Some medical professionals, they are considering addiction to a substance a disease, and others don't. Habits like chewing your fingernails, but to the point where you might be chewing until you bleed, is a habit that is unusual. Would a doctor consider that a disease? Like I said, it would vary from doctor to doctor. So come up with your own definition. Now, a disorder is generally termed as something that is less serious than a disease. So just be aware of that. There are different types of diseases, two main types. One of them is infectious disease. These are diseases that you catch. So they are transmitted by pathogens, and some examples of those things that you catch are bacteria and viruses. So like strep throat is a bacterial infectious disease. The Zika virus is a virus that you catch. Protozoans like Giardia that you catch if you are drinking water out in the backcountry. There's a little protist that makes its home in your intestine and causes you to have severe diarrhea and vomiting and high fever for about 2 weeks. That's a disease that you catch. Fungi will actually get into your body and make you very ill and can potentially kill you. And then there are these prion proteins that can make you sick and cause disease. Then there are non-infectious diseases. These are diseases that develop but are not caused by something that you catch. So cancer is an example. Over time, your DNA can get damaged and that can result in cancer. During the cell cycle, some of those checkpoints that we learned about don't work properly and cancer results. Heart disease is another example. Sometimes there's a genetic predisposition to having heart disease, and you don't catch that. And diet can often cause heart disease, and that is something that develops over time. And then there are genetic diseases. These are diseases caused by malformations or mutations in DNA. By definition, a genetic disease is a disease caused by one or more mutations in the human DNA. And here's kind of how it works big picture. So in eukaryotic cells, the DNA is contained in the nucleus of the cell. And that DNA is so precious and so important that that information does not leave the nucleus unless the cell is dividing. But the message from the DNA needs to get from the DNA to a ribosome where protein can get made. So this other copy of information called RNA gets made inside of the nucleus, and then that information carries the DNA's information, and it leaves the nucleus and goes out into the cytoplasm and eventually meets up with a ribosome. That RNA gets read by the ribosome and then proteins get made. Well, diseases happen, genetic diseases happen when those proteins never get made because there's something wrong with that RNA strand. Or if the RNA strand is copied incorrectly, then the protein that gets made isn't the right protein. So because there are mistakes in the protein, it doesn't work properly, and that can cause disease. Let's talk about mutations. So mutations are mistakes in DNA, and some of those mistakes you get simply because your parents, their DNA had some mistakes in it and they passed it on to you. Also, just randomly, DNA gets mistakes in it, and that happens sometimes during your development. Also, mutations happen throughout your life. So every time a cell divides, there is a greater chance that a mistake will occur during DNA replication. And then finally, there are all of these environmental factors that can affect your DNA negatively. So UV radiation, different chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, and viruses. For example, the Zika virus that's been in the news, that virus goes in and attacks the DNA and causes the babies that are affected by that virus to have a disease called microcephaly, and that's when the brain is very underdeveloped. What's interesting is that some mutations are actually beneficial to you. Let's talk about an example. So if we look at this moth population, at one point in time, all of the, or most of the moths were white, and then there were a few moths that had a mutation, and that caused them to be black. Now, back in the 1800s in England during the Industrial Revolution, those well, there were a lot of factories that started up, and those factories burned coal, and the smoke went up into the atmosphere and then settled on the ground and on the trees, and it caused all of the trees to be really dark. So at that point in time, most of the moths were white, but the birds could see those white moths on the black trees and ate them all up. It was the moths that had the mutation that made them black that became a positive mutation simply because that moth was able to blend in. Over time, that mutation caused the population to change because the population of white moths eventually changed into black moths because of environmental factors. And something to know about evolution is that it happens not so much gradually, but in these uh, quick moments. So something in the environment happens that causes populations to change. Individuals that weren't fit at one time became more fit and were surviving and passed on their traits as a result. Here is an example of how some genetic diseases come about. So during meiosis, there are cells that have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And during meiosis, those chromosomes get split apart. And if each of those chromosomes separates into these two haploid cells, and then that chromosome gets separated, and all of the DNA is divided equally along these gametes, then everything is fine. But sometimes those chromosomes don't separate, and that's called non-disjunction. So those chromosomes get pulled together as a pair into one cell during meiosis. Then at that point after the division, these two cells down here have extra DNA. They actually have 24 chromosomes. And then these two cells over here, they have 22 chromosomes. So in both cases, too many chromosomes or too few chromosomes will result in a genetic disease. Notice that this non-disjunction can happen during meiosis 1, like in this case, or meiosis 1 can happen just fine and the chromosomes are divided evenly into those cells, but then the chromosome does not separate into individual chromatids. So then these sperm or egg cells have extra DNA, and then one of the cells doesn't have enough DNA. Additionally, if that separation doesn't happen properly in this pair of chromosomes, the sex chromosomes, then there can be genetic diseases as well. In this example, because of non-disjunction, this egg had 2 female sex chromosomes. You should only have 1. And then in this egg, there were uh, no sex chromosomes at all. So let's look at this egg with extra chromosomes. If that gets fertilized by this sperm with an X sex chromosome, then there will be 3 X sex chromosomes, and that results in a disease called triple X. Individuals with this disease have severe handicaps in mental ability, and they live a tougher life. If that egg with 2 X sex chromosomes gets fertilized by a sperm carrying a Y sex chromosome, that individual will be a boy, and they have an extra X chromosome, so they're making more female hormones. That disease, oops, let's back up here. That disease is called Klinefelter syndrome, and men with this disease, they are taller, and they have reduced facial hair like a woman. They have breast development. They have osteoporosis. Their bones break down, which is typically a female disease. Their fat is distributed in more feminine areas like the buttocks, like the thighs, like the belly, and the breasts. And then these men have testicular atrophy, so they are sterile and they don't produce sperm. Another example of a genetic disease is Down syndrome, and this occurs when there's non-disjunction during meiosis, and there's one extra copy of chromosome 21. Now, aside from certain physical characteristics, individuals with Down syndrome also have these other functional characteristics. Unfortunately, these individuals have congenital heart disease, and they sometimes have an abnormal pelvis, which causes them to be more likely to have back pain, difficulty walking later in life. These individuals sometimes are short a rib, which isn't a huge deal. So just be aware that with genetic diseases, along with the obvious structural characteristics, there are often other characteristics that you can't see that make life difficult. Now, we've been talking about genetic diseases that are caused by having an extra chromosome or being short a chromosome. There are also diseases where, let's go back to this slide, where if you look at one specific chromosome and one gene on that chromosome, there's a mistake there, and that can cause a severe disease as well. So, looking at a chromosome, there can be a deletion of a gene. So, in this example, let's say that this gene is for lactose. Sorry, this gene is for the lactase enzyme. Well, this person is now lactase intolerant. Boy, I just butchered that. Let's try that one more time. This gene is for the lactase enzyme, and because this person doesn't have it, they are lactose intolerant. Notice that a gene can be doubled. So let's say that this is the gene for hemoglobin. Now, this person can carry more oxygen in their blood because they have more hemoglobin. Genes can get switched around, and both of these things could be a benefit. They could also be a hindrance and cause a pretty severe genetic disease, or they could cause a developing fetus to abort naturally. Then there are specific mutations on a gene. So one base pair on a gene, one nitrogenous base, can cause a terrible disease. An example is cystic fibrosis.